Hey there everybody, it's Mike DiLisio with another solo mode review. Today I'm going to be taking a look at the solo mode for Imperium, Classics or Legends, from designers Nigel Buckle and David Turczi and publisher Osprey Games. Imperium is a deck building game, an asymmetrical deck building game where you are playing as a particular civilization and you are trying to build yourself up in such a way that you gain technology and get ever stronger. So let me take you over to the table. I'll show you how the solo game plays. Then we'll come back here and I'll give you my final thoughts. Okay, here we see a solo setup for Imperium Classics, and in the case of this example, I'd be playing as the Romans here, and the bot opponent would be the Macedonians. The way the game is designed is that there are asymmetric civilizations that you are playing as and against, and the bot system works for any of the civilizations that are either in this Imperium Classics box here, which is the one that I'm using for this, but it works the exact same way in the Imperium's Legends set. I mean, they are kind of mix and match. You can use any of them, but the bottom line here is that you can play against any of the civilizations that are in either of the two boxes. The differences to setup with a multiplayer game, the main difference is this row right here, okay? These numbers and these cards here are part of the bot's deck of cards, okay? And so I set up my play area exactly the same way as I would in a multiplayer game. And as far as the general card market, it's set up in exactly the same way as a multiplayer game as well. The one thing you do have to keep in mind is that there are certain cards that you're going to remove in the solo game, and it would also be in the two-player game. So you see cards that say 3+ or 4 on them. Those have to get removed from the game because clearly this is not a 3 or a 4-player game. So if you've removed those cards, otherwise the setup is generally identical. You set up the bot's deck a little bit differently, although you're still using the same cards, and it is still basically simulating the same thing. The bot is still trying to get through its cards to become a more developed group of people to eventually switch from a barbarian state to an empire, a civilized state, and they're going to be doing that through playing cards just like you would as a player. So one thing I do want to point out is that I've got this set up for the initial difficulty of the game. There's an easy way to kind of change the difficulty. It's right here. This is the solo rule book. Both of the boxes, Classics and Legends, comes with the same solo rule book. And it goes through the different aspects of the game, one of them being the difficulty level. So I'm setting this up as the Chieftain difficulty, which they recommend for your first game. And the main difference here is that you've got this little marker here blocking off that spot. It means that for the most part, the bot is going to be taking fewer actions a turn than if that wasn't there and another one of their cards was there. So on your turn, you do what you normally would. You're spending these action tokens to be able to play cards that you have in your hand. I would have started with 5 cards. And I'm playing cards, I'm activating cards, I'm hopefully getting rid of these unrest cards because those, generally speaking, clog up your deck. You're playing your turn as per normal. You don't really have to affect what you do in any real sense. Things change up when it is the bot's turn. And I'm not going to go into a high level, or excuse me, I'm not going to go into a deep overview of the game. Tom did a review of the multiplayer game where he probably is going to go into more detail on the actual mechanics of the game. I just want to focus on how the solo bot plays. So let's focus on that. On the bot's turn, what they're going to do is roll this 6-sided die. Okay, this is a standard 6-sided die, and it's going to correspond to potentially blocking one of these cards. So I roll it, and I rolled a 2. So I'll just go ahead and place the die on top of this card. All right? It means that on this turn, we're not going to resolve this card. We're going to resolve these other 3 cards in order from left to right. So you flip over the first card. Now, this one is an unrest card. This is something that actually is not in the rule book, and I'm going to mention that in my review section of this video. But in the case of a bot flipping over an unrest card, it just goes back into the unrest pile. We skip this card. Then we flip this card. Okay, we see here we've got a phalanx card. Now, you don't pay any attention to what the text on the card says. This is only applicable in the multiplayer game. So, how do you know what the bot does? Well, in this solo rulebook, you look to a series of charts. Now, you're only going to have to pay attention to one of these charts. In this case, it's the Macedonians, because that is my opponent. There are two charts. One is the Macedonians while they're in the barbarian state, which is at the beginning of the game, and then a second chart over here once the Macedonians flip over and become an empire. So right now, I'm only paying attention to this chart right here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to resolve this card based upon what this chart says. So let's maybe put it down here. You start at the top of the list and you go down. And if something is not represented on the card, you skip it. So this is showing a fame card. This is not a fame card, so I don't pay any attention to that. This is a specific titled card that is in the Macedonians deck called Glory. If this were the card I flipped over, I would do what this says. Next, is it a card that has a barbarian symbol? This one does not. Next, is it a region card? This is not a region card. However, it does have this symbol right here. So since this is the first symbol that applies on this card, I go down and it says to gain 1 population. So the bot would gain 1 population that I would put over there. Then I continue on to the next card. This is Philip II. Looking at the Macedonians, it's not a fame card, it's not a glory card. Aha, it is a barbarian card. If able, spend 3 population to break through for one of these types of cards and then put this card into history. Otherwise, if able, spend 3 materials to acquire a uncivilized or civilized or uncivilized card and put this card in your history. Otherwise, break through for a region card. All right, so the bot at the beginning of the game does not have those resources. It doesn't have the materials that it needs to do this first thing. It doesn't have the population to do what it asks for. So we're going to break through for a region card, take a region card, and add it to its deck. All right? And then you would replace that card. Once you have resolved all of the cards that have been put out in the line here, what you're going to do is you're going to place a progress marker above the card that was rolled. So in other words, in this case, since it was under card 2, we're going to put a progress marker on that card. We're going to shift this one down, and we're going to refill the row for the next bot's turn from their deck of cards. All right? You're going to continue to do this for all of the bot's turn. You're just going to be focusing on what the effects are for any particular card, and then once it has become an empire, it's going to have different things that you're going to take care of for each of those types of cards. All right? Back and forth, playing just as if you were playing against a regular opponent. The game ends when either scoring or collapse is triggered, just as in a multiplayer game. You are going to be counting up your points, and you're going to be counting up the points of the bot as well. There are some specific scoring rules for the bot. Each progress marker is worth 1 point for the bot, and every 10 population and material in any combination, so you can mix them and match them. Every 10 of them is worth a point for the bot, and you score every card in the bot's hand and play area, deck and discard pile and history. You don't score for bot cards in their dynasty deck because obviously they hadn't got to those yet. There are, again, some the kind of asterisk cards like these cards here are going to count as 5 points for the bot. If you score more points for the bot, more points than the bot, you win. If you score equal to or less than the bot, you lose. Another thing to keep in mind is that there is a campaign mode here for the solo game, which allows you to play a series of linked solo games against bots that increase in difficulty. So the idea here is you're trying to win 5 games before you lose 4 of them. You choose which nation you want to play as, and you're going to play as that nation for every game in the campaign. All right? You play against the bot on the chieftain difficulty first, and you can play multiple campaigns against the same nation unless you win. All right? And it has rules for if you win a game and if you lose a game. And there is also a spot here in the book where you can keep track of those campaigns on a log. All right, again, a very high-level overview of the solo game, but hopefully that gives you a pretty good idea. Let's head back over and I'll give you my thoughts on the game. Okay, so as I said in the overview, I wasn't going into a deep dive on the rules. This is a game that has a fair amount of rules overhead, and so I just wanted to give you just a basic structure of the flow of the solo game and kind of how the bot takes its turns. Again, if you really want to know how the game plays, you'll either probably need to watch a playthrough, maybe multiple playthroughs, or try to find your way through the rule book, which is something I'll be talking about here in a minute. All right, so the first thing I want to cover are some solo benchmarks. These are some big picture ideas that help me assess if I'm going to pull this particular solo game off the shelf versus another one. The first thing I like to do is talk about win-loss conditions. Is this a beat your high score variant, or are you playing against a virtual opponent? And in the case of Imperium, Classics and Legends, it is very much a beat a opponent, a virtual opponent. And this is done in such a way that you saw you can play as any of the civilizations in the game. You can play against any of the civilizations in the game. Certain civilizations will have more exceptions to the rules than others, and maybe even have some differences in their setup or in the types of resources that they'll use or that they'll start with. But for the most part, you can play as any of the civilizations and you can play against any of the civilizations, and that's a huge, huge plus for this game. I do not think it would feel nearly as satisfying if you were just simply trying to reach a score matrix. In this game, head-to-head feels very much in line with the design. The other thing I like to do is talk about setup and teardown. Now, I will tell you, you probably got an impression of it just by looking at the overview. This is not a game that you're going to take up out of the box and be ready to go in 2 or 3 minutes. There is a fair amount of setup involved. First of all, you need to make sure that you have the appropriate cards for player count, taking out the 3 and 4 player cards. Then you have to set them up in particular ways and set up all of the different areas of the table, whether it's your civilized and uncivilized cards and your region cards and tributary cards, and then putting out a certain number of them and then shuffling the rest into the main deck, and then getting your deck set up in a very particular way, getting the bot's deck set up in a very particular way. This is a game that has a significant amount of time for setup, and teardown is also going to take more time because you have to resort the cards, or at least I feel you have to resort the cards so that you're not going through even more of an arduous process the next time you choose to play the game. That being said, with that long setup and teardown time, I don't feel that the ratio is off for the amount of time that you take playing the game. If the game was over in 15 or 20 minutes, if it was a quick filler deck builder game and it took that long to set up and tear down, that would be a huge negative for me, but it is not. This is a full game experience. It's something I'm going to be talking about in my overall impressions, the length of the game. Just take my word for it that you're going to be playing this game for a while. It's not going to be over in the amount of time it took you to set up or tear down the game. So in this case, it's a neutral. I don't feel like it's a positive because it does take a fair amount of time, but it's not a negative either because it's in service of a full gaming experience. The other thing I like to talk about is rules, and this is a significant issue, all right? The rule book for the game, multiplayer, let's start with the multiplayer rule book. I don't think it's a good rule book. I think it's fine as a resource after you are understanding of the game, after you're comfortable with the rules to the game. The rule book works fine as a reference to look back at it and say, oh yeah, okay, that's what this keyword means. That's what that keyword means. That's kind of what's happening here. But as a way to learn the game, learning it just through the rule book is very, very challenging. It's not necessarily that there are huge things left out of the multiplayer book. I'll come back to that. But it's just not written in such a way that I found it to be user-friendly. It was quite a challenge to learn this game from the rule book, and I would recommend for most new people learning this game that they hunt down a playthrough. There are already plenty of them out there that do a great job of running you through the game, both multiplayer and solo. And that's probably your best bet because the rule book as written is rough. Now, the solo rulebook, this is a positive and a negative. I absolutely love the fact that there is a dedicated solo rulebook, that it's on its own. It is unique. It's in its own book. That is great. When you can pull that off, I applaud that for publishers. I mean, it's a significant expense. It's a full color rule book, stapled rule book. It's basically exactly the same in length and in quality as the multiplayer rule book. So that part is great. I love that. On the negative side, there are some issues with the rules there too. There is one very significant rule that's not in the book at all, which is how you handle unrest cards when you flip them over for the bot's turn. When I first tried learning the game, I assumed that since it wasn't listed in any of the tables, that it counts as an other card, or what you do if you're going down that list and none of these apply, then you do what's at the bottom, the other. Well, that's not what you're supposed to do, and that significantly changes the game. When you turn over a unrest card for the bot, you just put it in the unrest pile. It's a big thing. Now, yes, on Board Game Geek, maybe even on Osprey's website, I haven't checked that to be sure, but there are places online where this is discussed and is pointed out. There's an errata, all that type of stuff. That's great. But again, I don't know if you should assume that people are going to go to Board Game Geek or to any other resource. That really would have been nice to have in the rule book. I'm sure it was just an oversight. I imagine if this gets reprinted, that they will address it at that point, but it is something that is important to point out. All right. Art and components is next. First of all, I absolutely adore the art in this game. This artist is one of my favorite artists in board gaming, and boy, it really continues here. There are so many individual unique pieces of art in this game. It really brings this to life. It is vibrant. It is, in my eyes, beautiful. It really helps you feel like you are this distinct group of people playing against a different, distinct group of people. I have nothing but good things to say about the art. I absolutely love it. The tokens aren't my favorite part of the game, although they are functional. I'm not a big fan of token-heavy card games in general, and that might be something that is unique to me. That might just be part of my gaming tastes, but I find that to be a bit fiddly, where you're moving tokens, and the idea of you get these 3 action tokens and just kind of move them down. I guess I understand the need for that, although I rarely found myself actually physically manipulating those tokens. There are ways you can get other extra actions, and then it's helpful to have those tokens to do that, or to put the little X tokens when you exhaust cards, but I don't know. It's just, it wasn't my favorite aspect of the game. I didn't feel like it was necessarily of the best quality, but they are functional. The cards are also not of the highest quality, but I don't feel like they are bad or poor quality. They've seemed to hold up to repeated plays. I've played both of these games, Classics and Imperium, or excuse me, and Legends, multiple times. The cards seem to be holding up fine. I'm personally not going to sleeve these cards. There's a whole lot of cards there, and I'm not noticing any significant nicks or issues with the cards. You know, I'm finding that they are warping just a little bit, but it's nothing that is preventing me from being able to play the game. And so it's just a little bit of a negative. They're not the highest quality cards I've ever played with, but they are generally workable. I don't know if I should count this as a component, but one thing I would have liked to have seen, because it's not a component that's in the game, that I would have loved to have seen, is I showed you in the overview for the back of the solo rulebook, you've got those charts for all of the different civilizations. I understand why they did it that way, and it is perfectly functional. It works just fine to have them in the rule book, but it would have been so much nicer if you could have had cards, maybe tarot-sized cards, where they were double-sided, and on one side you had the barbarian state, and on the other side you had the empire state. That would have been so much nicer to just have that in front of you as a reference card, rather than having to kind of have the book near you and flip it. And sometimes the chart for one state would be on one page and then the other on the other page. Not a huge deal, but I would have liked to have seen that. Okay, so for my overall solo impressions, I want to talk about a few things that did not work as well for me to begin with, and then end with the things that I did enjoy about the game. First thing is that this game has a, I feel, high barrier to entry. This is not an easy game to pick up, and the box might make you think that it is because, oh, it's a deck building, civilization themed game. It's going to be, you know, I've seen deck building games a million times before. I know exactly what I'm getting here. You probably don't know exactly what you're getting here because this is a game that has highly asymmetric natures to a highly asymmetric nature to it, whereas one civilization will potentially play very differently from another. Now, not necessarily that the rules are different, but the strategies are different. You might have some keywords that are really only specific to yours that you might not have been familiar with just for the base game. So there is a bit of a high barrier to entry, and the rule book adds to that, quite honestly. The rule book is, as I mentioned, not the most user-friendly, and so you have to be aware that this is a game that can be slightly intimidating when you first try to learn it. It can also be quite long, and I talked about this during the setup and teardown portion of the review. It is not a kind of a quick, snappy game. It's a game that is generally going to take, I've found, over an hour. And oftentimes significantly more than an hour, especially when I'm first kind of getting familiar with a civilization. If I'm playing them for the first or second time, it takes me quite a bit longer because I'm trying to get a handle on how that deck of cards representing this group of people plays. So that is something that you have to keep in mind. It's a relatively long game. The last kind of negative thing is that when I'm playing a solo game, I tend to pay close attention to the amount of administration I'm doing on the bot's turn versus my own turn. And this is one of those games where the time that it takes to play the bot turn can oftentimes be as long or longer than my own turns. That's not my favorite ratio in the world. I do tend to like games where the bot turn is very quick to administer, very simple to administer, and I'm spending most of the time playing my turn. That's not necessarily the case in Imperium. The bot turns, there's a fair amount of administration and upkeep to take care of, and it takes a little bit of time. However, the payback that you get for that is pretty significant, and that's where I'm going to get to the things that I like about the game. First of all, there are some fantastic thematic and historical touches in this game. I was a history teacher for almost 20 years, a high school history teacher. And just little touches that I've seen throughout this game really were something I appreciated. So, you know, playing as the Qin dynasty and seeing the Mandate of Heaven card or the Confucianism card, that just really brought some great memories back of teaching that in class, and even seeing the little thematic touches about how those cards were representing particular things in the game, abstracted concepts put together in a neat thematic way. So I really appreciate the amount of attention to detail that clearly went into this design from a thematic point of view. I think they did a really, really good job of that, and I appreciate it. It is also an extremely clever deck building game. I have a real appreciation for the design of this game. I can just tell, you know, after you've played a number of games, especially after you've played a lot of games of a particular genre, like deck building, for example, I really appreciate a game that stands out. And this game absolutely stands out from other deck builders I've played. It doesn't really feel like any other deck building game that I've played, although it has some of the familiar tropes that you would expect. It absolutely feels different, and it feels clever, it feels novel, it feels unique, and it feels very, very well designed. This game has felt generally balanced when I've been playing. Of course, when you play a group for the first time, you know, you oftentimes have to figure out how it plays. But I've really appreciated all the little touches I've seen, the design touches I've seen throughout the game. Another thing that is a big positive for me, especially in the context of this review, a solo game review, is I feel like this game is probably best as a solo game. It is not marketed as a solo game exclusively. This is a multiplayer game. However, I find it best as a solo game. In multiplayer games, especially beyond 2 players, I feel like it's too long and there's too much downtime. I honestly don't know that I would ever want to play this game at more than 2, but I prefer it most as a solo game. This is not a solo variant that was tacked on at the end to keep the solo gamers happy. Far from it. To me, this feels like a game that from its inception, I have no way to prove this, but it feels like from its inception, from the beginning germination of the ideas of this game, it was built with a solo game in mind. It feels like it was all integrated. Like every design point of the game feels like the solo aspect of it was built at the same time. Not later, not trying to shoehorn this idea in. It feels organic to the game. That's a huge, huge plus. And the last positive I have is that the replay value of this game is off the charts. Now I know for some people, they feel like that is a metric that doesn't, is maybe overstated. And if that's the case for you, that's fine. You don't even have to consider this. But for other people, they want to know, is this going to be a game that I can play 2, 3, 4, 5 times? And in the case of Imperium, it is wholeheartedly yes, and quite a lot more than that. I really feel like this is a game you could play 100 times or more if you really like the game. Trying out all the different civilizations, kind of seeing how they play. Because it's going to take you multiple games just to get a handle on the basic strategy of a particular group. And then once you've done that, you could play it more to feel like you've really, really kind of mastered that group. And then maybe once you've done that, and especially if you've gone through the solo campaign, you could do it with one of the other many civilizations that are included within these 2 boxes of games. And I would not be shocked if more civilizations were coming later. I don't know anything about that, but it sure seems like it would be something that would be easy to implement in the future. And so this is a game, as I said, that has huge replay value. All right, well, a lot of information in the game, a lot of information here. Overall, I feel like this is a very, very good solo game. I'm calling it an outstanding solo game. I'm going to be giving it an 8.5 out of 10, a seal of excellence. This is one of my favorite solo games in quite a while, and it's definitely up there with my favorite deck building games, both solo and multiplayer right across the board. Just a very, very solid design, and it's one that you should check out. Just know that you may have a little bit of struggle with the rules if you're relying on the rule book. All right, well, that's it for me. Mike DiLisio signing off from Dice Tower headquarters.